Hello guys and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where Russia got back all lands it has ever occupied, basically making it one of the world's best empires of all time, rivaling the British and the Mongolians, even more than the Russian Empire did in our timeline. It is going to become in contention for the number one spot, as the USA has only lost Alaska, but Russia has gained the Baltics, Finland, parts of Poland, all of Ukraine, Moldova, the Caucasus Mountain region, northern Iran, all of Afghanistan, Manchuria, North Korea, and a few other lands here and there, including all of Central Asia and Alaska. This will massively bump up Russian power, and we're going to see how this influences the world. First of all, I have absolutely no doubt, even if I remove NATO, a new NATO will spring up. With Russia having only grown stronger from their weakened state in our world, the world would not want them taking over. They would do pretty much everything that they can to stop the Russians from expanding, but will they be fast enough? That is a separate question. Of course, who will create this alliance? It will be created by the United States of America, with Canada joining instantly, along with the United Kingdom and France. It's all very, very major US allies who have no reason not to join. After this, certain countries bordering Russia are going to want in, but they are going to have a bit more trouble and be slightly slower. Russia is, of course, going to take advantage of this, and a weakened Poland is going to stand absolutely no chance against the strengthened Russia. They've lost their capital of Warsaw and a significant amount of other important territories, so I do not see the Russians losing this conflict. It will not be another Ukraine. The Poles will lose. In the end, the Russians will annex them, although this will be very frowned upon, as the world, including China, is going to condemn this new Russian state. As China has lost all of Manchuria, I believe Beijing as well. They have lost Beijing, but I cannot know from sure. From there, the Russians are going to take advantage of their weakest neighbor, North Korea. If you didn't know what this is, I am counting the Russian occupation of North Korea after World War II, as that was on a lot of the maps I found of Russia at its greatest extent, meaning that North Korea has very, very little land, only having that which they gained from South Korea after the Korean War. Quickly enough, Russia, or maybe even South Korea, would take over this land, as it really just, honestly, would be one of, if not the weakest state in the world. With these new lands, Russia would continue to push around their weaker neighbors, soon enough eyeing out Czechia and Slovakia. They would declare war, and more of these countries would start to worry about what may happen to them next. No, why did I choose the yellow? The Russians will quickly steamroll into northern Slovakia and down to Czechia. The northern Czechian Bohemian Mountains would harm them, but with Czechia being cut off into two and Slovakia capitulating, the fall of Prague, and therefore this fall of the entire country, is inevitable. Once more, Russia would annex both countries, hoping to proclaim some kind of global empire status. At this point, they still cannot overshadow the US, as the economy and overall just the strength of the US is not rivaled even by this incredibly strengthened Russia. Their goal is to end that, and to fully take over pretty much everything, all of Europe. I highly doubt they could get across the Atlantic and start to threaten continental US or Canada, but since they do control Alaska, who knows? They could try something. Although in a war, they'd probably lose that, wouldn't they? Yeah, the point is, even with all of these new lands, this new Russia is not invulnerable, and they would still at least come to some form of stalemate when fighting off the USA. Soon enough, the US's alliance will also spread to Germany and the Benelux country. Russia, seeing that it's running out of time, decides that expansion is fast, and they declare war on Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Serbia. These aren't normally allies, but in this case they will have to work together, or else, oh, Budapest is gone. Although they tried to get their armies in working order, a lot of infighting, along with just terrible communication, will allow the Russians to break through along the coast past the Danube, which the blue team was hoping to use as their greatest line of defense. With this, the Transylvanian mountains also fall, leading to the complete capitulation of Romania. Serbia might try their best, but in the end, the Russians would come out on top. What would they do? Well, in an effort to unite all the Slavs and anyone else who they deem should be Russian, which is pretty much everybody, they're going to annex all of these countries once more. An even bigger and more controversial move than annexing Poland. With this, the West would start to freak out and basically make it so that anybody could join their alliance, as long as you're democratic and you hate Russia. With those being the new terms, a lot of the world would start to join. It is still, oh my god, can I not get this line? It is still technically limited to only Europe, but the US is starting talks to, well, not Europe, but the North Atlantic, to expand it to the entire world. Russia, knowing this, and also knowing that, sadly, since the army is over here, they cannot get it using reasonable supply chains over here to attack South Korea or Japan, and soon enough, South Korea and Japan do fall to the American alliance, which is only going to continue to spread. As the Russians expand, everybody is basically going to hate them. Even the Chinese, who are one of their not even biggest supporters, but just somebody that they can fall back on for trade in real life, hate them. Hate them for taking away Manchuria, and if anything, want to declare war on the Russians and kill them. Unluckily for them, the Russians are still more powerful than the Chinese militarily, and the Chinese would eventually lose. Russia also attempts to get itself away from Putin and all of that authoritarian stuff to align itself further with India, who they see as their one possible ally, offering them Pakistani destruction and expansion into all Hindus everywhere and pretty much everyone else on the Indian subcontinent. From there, Russia will decide that the Black Sea and the North Sea are theirs, and continue their insane expansion further. Soon enough, though, the US's alliance would spread to both Denmark and Norway, with Sweden doing their best to get in. Russia is not going to be able to deal with this, and is going to have to come to some sort of compromise where they don't leave the Nordics alone, but as they invade Sweden, Sweden nearly finishes their process. This leaves Russia in a bad situation where, if they were to continue this war, some new regulation by the Yellow Team would cause it so that they end up at war with the US. So they're going to attempt to create some form of reasonable peace deal with the Swedes, who don't want to get absolutely destroyed. Sweden hands over a lot of northern lands, which aren't very populated, but are still fairly important for Sweden, as they control many resources that the Swedes can use. Still, the Russians are going to go ahead and rip that away from them, and some form of Nordic unity might even be possible in this world, as Sweden, who is the strongest of the bunch, is weakened, and Denmark and Norway might just want to not die. Even inside the American alliance, they don't want their voices to be overshadowed by the greater powers. It's not going to happen just yet, but that is definitely a possibility. Russia is also going to annex this island that I forgot the name of. With that, the Russian Empire is going to push south. With Greece's application being nearly done, they once again know that their only chance to dominate the entirety of the Balkans is to attack now. They will be attacking Greece and Turkey, along with pretty much the rest of the Balkans at the same time, forming up their biggest challenge yet. For the Russians, this is a war of no choice, as with American expansion as it is, soon enough every single one of these countries will be under American control. Something which Russia cannot let happen. Without China, they are fully on their own, and they need everything they can get. We're also going to be assuming that they have no rebellions or basically having no issues at all controlling these territories, as if they did, they would collapse almost immediately. We also have the Chinese forming up a small yet resilient alliance, as the Russians have pretty much just annexed Mongolia, who didn't even want to bother fighting when they absolutely knew they would lose. And the Chinese, now holding one of the longest borders in the world with the Russians, are gonna want to try and basically keep the Russians far away, but also keep them from not wanting to kill them. Kind of hard to do. Laos and Cambodia are gonna join in, and Pakistan, well, China doesn't know if they want Pakistan. If they invite Pakistan to their alliance, war with the Russians is almost certain, and at least for now, they're gonna try and stop that. Back in Europe, Russia is gonna have a hard time, honestly, pushing into these countries. They quickly steamroll Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Kosovo. Once they get down to Greece, though, they are halted in the mountains, and in Turkey, practically no progress is made. These two are fighting better than the Russians had expected, and they are honestly struggling to push in. They do cut them off by land and capture more Greek and Turkish land, but the city of Istanbul is still being held. With this, the Turks and the Greeks start to plead for help. The world really either needs to help them now or watch them die. Who will help them? Well, honestly, the West will try their best, but there's really nothing they can do, as the USA does not want war with this absolute superpower either, who has taken over a massive portion of the earth. Soon enough, though, Pakistan will be allowed into the Chinese faction, which infuriates India, along with Myanmar. With this, India and Russia will start basically a two-person partnership, as India is feeling completely boxed in by the Chinese, completely just stuck. They will ally themselves fully with the Russians whilst keeping relations okay with the US, at least as okay as they can be when you're siding with the Russians. We're going to see India starting their own expansions, not really by their choice, but by the choice of China, who is pretty much forcing their hand. They need to take control of Sri Lanka and Nepal before China can basically take them over themselves. Russia's and the USA are going to have their own fight, but as are India and China, who fight for control in the region, each with their own allies. Russia, seeing a semi-stalemate in Greece and Turkey, is going to invade all of Persia, modern-day Iran. They've already been weakened, losing their capital and much of their most industrialized land, but they still have a lot of that sweet, sweet oil and a coastline along the Persian Gulf, which kept them fairly powerful. They will also be invading Iraq and Syria in this time, as Syria has already, some people in Syria have already revolted in favor of the Russians, as the civil war there only got worse after the Russians dedicated a lot of forces there. With this going on, the Middle East will start to join the American alliance as it turns into a less American-dominated Western alliance and more into everybody who hates Russia join. The US does give up a lot of power in this situation, as they are sharing strength with a multitude of other countries in this alliance instead of keeping it all themselves, but it does allow access for many more nations to join in, which in the end is going to benefit them. We soon see Australia, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, along with the UAE, joining in. And in North Africa, Morocco joins, which kind of angers everybody up here, specifically Algeria and Mauritania. But what are they supposed to do? Colombia also joins, and multiple other countries are considering it at this moment. The Russians are only going to continue their slaughter. The Iranian mountains are going to slow them down, but they are going to do their best to crush the Iranian resistance. They're also going to push into Iraq, capturing most of the country, causing it to surrender, and meeting up with Syrian rebels. With an even longer front, Turkey starts to struggle. Although they can't be struggling as much as Greece, as once they lose a lot of their mountains and their hilly areas where they can just hide out, the Russians steamroll the country. They then begin naval landings along the Turkish coastline, And although Turkey is doing their absolute best to hold out, them and Iran will soon enough be surrendering, along with Cyprus, who actually joined the American alliance in time. Israel will also join. Saudi Arabia attempts to veto this, but it is in the end allowed, along with Jordan and even Lebanon, who has a short revolution. With the Middle East now more firmly under Western control, although, like I said, this is more of a more inclusive alliance than the mostly Western-controlled NATO in modern day, with many more Middle Eastern countries being fully exempt from most of the procedures, except for defense against the Russians. What's Russia going to do with this land? Well, for the first time, they're not actually going to be annexing all of it. They finally decide that what they have is enough, and what they need is another ally they can rely on to hold a front. So what are they going to do? Take over most of the land and leave the rest to a mainly weakened state. They want the entirety of the Black Sea as theirs, which is obviously granted. They also want certain lands out of Iraq, which are, of course, granted, and a coastline on the on the Arabian Sea, which is granted. They are pretty much expanded into every single country they took over except for Syria, whose new insanely Russian-aligned government, pretty much just a Russian puppet, is going to take over all of these territories. That is going to cause it to be Russian in all but name. From here, Russia will annex the rest of the lands, giving them a very, very long border with this anti-Russian association, which is going to continue to expand in a moment. And from there, we're going to be seeing the final war of this video, which is actually not going to be the West against Russia. As even with all of this new land, with the rebellion brewing, and the Russians being overextended beyond compare, they would probably lose. And since this video is about Russian dominance, I cannot have them lose. Therefore, they will not be going to war with the West, at least not until they have become even more powerful in some way, shape, or form. Possibly, which I am actually going to be adding, a new Russian-aligned, not a Russian puppet government, but a Russian-aligned government in Africa, where it could be anywhere, but in this case, it is going to be in a part of the DRC, where the Russians stage a mass-scale rebellion in their favor. With this much of the world already under their control, they decide who can stop us, and over here in the DRC, a Russian-aligned government takes control of each area, quickly expanding and revolting across other areas. Soon enough, the DRC is under Russian control, and from here it is going to take over the Congo, and this just causes even more problems for the Russians, as many more countries are deciding that their own people can't even be trusted to not be conspiring with the Russians, and that they need safety. With this, a lot of the Americas, including Brazil and Chile, join the American alliance, although Argentina does still refuse, stating that once the UK returns their islands, they will rejoin the US's side. Although they are still firmly on the American side of this new Cold War. With this, pretty much, a decent amount of Africa is also going to join this American alliance, including South Africa, and who else? Let's go ahead and add who's going to have a revolution in an American revolution, so to say. Angola. How about Angola? Angola is a fairly powerful African country, and Botswana. Botswana is going to join on their own terms for better trade deals, and Angola is going to have kind of a coup, which is going to put them in a heavily Western aligned situation, which is going to cause them to join the alliance. Whilst everyone else just is pretty much guaranteed by the US, except for Burundi and Rwanda, which are soon after taken over. Ooh, okay. Way too much unrealistic stuff here, but with the Russians regaining all the lands they've ever held, it's already unrealistic anyways. With this, the final war is going to be breaking out, which is all Russian-aligned nations against all Chinese aligned nations. This is gonna be the final fight, and although it looks very Russian dominated, China is still gonna have a fairly okay chance. At this point, losing all of Manchuria, China and India are about on par, so with Russian help, it really isn't a fair fight. It isn't a fair fight. We also see that Taiwan are going to join in on the Russian side. This is like 30 years after, so who knows what's going to happen. And Thailand's just going to see an opportunity to not die. Seeing how India is hoping to take over the entirety of basically the Asian part of the Indian Ocean, except for Arabia, they see this as their best chance. Soon enough, Bangladesh also joins in. And this really turns into anyone who wants to live joins the Chinese side. Anyone who wants to live joins the Indian and Russian side. Anyone who doesn't want to be bullied into joining a side joins the Chinese side. With this, the Great Asian War begins. India is quickly going to push down to Bangladesh and down the coastline of Myanmar, whilst Thailand is going to push up its tail and out into Cambodia and Laos. This is not going to be too difficult. These are fairly weak countries. What is going to be difficult is the push for China. The Russians are, of course, going to begin offensive all across the front line. I'm getting all tongue-tied here. Except for the Gobi Desert front, which pretty much nobody does anything with. They just ignore it. In Xinjiang, they don't send much either, but since the Chinese aren't looking to protect it very hard, it's still taken over. Down here in Pakistan, India's going to start sweeping through the country. In real life, India is already significantly more powerful than Pakistan, so here it's going to be incredibly one-sided. Pakistanis cannot do anything. They are overwhelmed from both sides and are absolutely destroyed. The Indians will attempt to push out, but mountains in Tibet and the Himalayas are going to stop them. In Bangladesh, though, which is highly densely populated, they're going to steamroll that country, and all of Myanmar's important lands are captured as well. From there, India's going to help Thailand capture all of Cambodia and Laos. Despite the jungly terrain, they will make it. Over here, where it is less, although still fairly mountainous, India's going to attempt another invasion, which is going to go just Not even that great, but at least they're making progress. And on the bloodiest front of the war by far, in northern China, around the city of Beijing, the Russians are going to begin their great invasion. Although the Chinese are going to be defending fiercely, the Russians begin to push around the around northern China. It isn't just the peninsula, it is all of, the entire region that is being attacked by Russian troops. The Russians are going to begin to push down the coastline, capturing many important Chinese cities, although the Chinese are not just going to stand by and recapture many of these lost lands. Much other land in the north is going to be captured by the Russians, but that is less important. They even attempt a naval landing, but the Chinese swiftly take care of that, as most of the Russian Navy is over here in the Baltic, which is closed off, but mainly in the Black and Mediterranean seas, as Egypt is not on great relations, but on working relations. Back on the Chinese front, the Chinese are going to attempt their own counteroffensive up their coastline, even managing to make a landing over here in North Korea. They're going to attempt to use this as a massive initiative to capture the entire of the Korean peninsula, which is going to go quite well. They even managed to push back the Russians slightly, as supply is a massive issue. Manchuria has many Chinese supporters, as life under the Russians has only been getting worse, whilst under the Chinese it was getting better. With that, many are going to start to revolt, and the Russians are going to have a massive issue, as this Chinese naval invasion turns into an absolutely mega Chinese revolt against the Russians. The Chinese will, of course, use this to their advantage, and it now looks like they're absolutely crushing. And they really aren't, though, as Indian support is arriving, and over here in Tibet we have anti-Chinese elements taking place, as China basically cracks down on anything that isn't Han Chinese at this time, being fully worried about of rebellion. Who would have guessed, though, that cracking down on people's traditions and religions only makes them angrier at you? Of course, this means the Indians will capture the entire region, as nobody can fight in these mountains except the people who live there, so whoever has the people who live there on their side are going to win. Xinjiang also fully supports the Russian invasion for the same reasons, causing the Chinese to retreat from the entire region. Now, it looks like a fairly fair fight, doesn't it? And it's not going to get much better for the Chinese. Although they do attempt to hold on to and even push further into Russian-occupied Manchuria, capturing Sebastopol, which was one of the most major battles of this entire video, as it causes China to have the entire supply advantage here. Russian troops are starving and dying, and I'm not saying the Chinese are the most well-equipped, but they are doing far better. Far, far better. With this, the Russians are starting to look into some sort of surrender plan where a compromised peace treaty is made. But the Russian elites just will not stand for this and start a massive counter-invasion around the city of Sebastopol. They start to push back down into North Korea, limiting Chinese gains whilst pushing them back across the entire border. This great Russian push is considered the only thing keeping the Russians in the war, as the Chinese soon push back and recapture a lot of the lands in the region. The Russians then decide that maybe it's better to just push all the way across, and after pushing through jungles and mountains, they finally reach some populated valleys in China, even reaching some of the major rivers. From here, they are able to start making it far further, as supplies getting much, much better. Up in the north, China is forced to get rid of some divisions so they can hold it in the center, and this causes the Russians to be able to reinvade Manchuria, at least to some extent. They push the Chinese back significantly, almost out of all Russian territories, although they still hold Beijing and North Korea. From here, the Russians are going to start a new advance from the south. It is originally very difficult, and it's actually mainly led by Indian and Thai divisions, causing thousands, tens of thousands, even a couple hundreds of thousands of deaths just to get to the coastline, which they do so successfully. And from there, it starts to pick up momentum. Soon enough, once again, though, the Chinese military arrives, puts them back in the forest, which causes them all to start to die. Before they all die, the Russians hope they can kill more Chinese, and that's going to go decently well, as, well, it's not really under their control, it's under Chinese control, but they do claim it, and nobody really denies that claim, as there are more Russian than Chinese troops. It's just a massive guerrilla warfare region. From there, the Russians are going to attempt to cut off and recapture North Korea. With the recapture of Pyongyang, they push down and kill or capture all Chinese divisions in the region, leading to the Second Battle of Beijing, the bloodiest battle of the war. In the beginning, the Chinese actually have some sort of initiative, pushing back the Russians further and further away from the city. The Russians, seeing these losses, dedicate more and more divisions, hoping that they can capture one of the most important Chinese cities there are, which they held at least in the beginning. They start a pincer maneuver to try and encircle the area, but the Chinese simply use this to their advantage, cutting off many Russian troops and starting to destroy them. The Russians then push around slightly, hoping to gain some form of advantage in this fight, which they do so eventually, and recapture certain parts of the city. Soon enough, the city is encircled, and this encirclement is just kind of thickened up a bit so that it can't be broken nearly as easily. And the bloodiest one day of the war happens as the Russians start to reconquer the whole city. With the city back under their control, the initiative has firmly flipped to the Russian side. All Chinese gains are destroyed, and now it truly does look like the Chinese are done for. with their one chance at a stalemate or even at a ceasefire, a compromised peace treaty, or even just not completely dying, gone, the Chinese are slowly going to start to die, with the Battle of Shanghai also being a Russian victory. And although the Russians had arguably even more deaths than the Chinese, as long as they didn't fake their numbers, the war has now ended. And the Russians are going to turn all of China into either their vassals or the vassals of their allies. This Middle Eastern nation that has control of this part of modern-day Iran is technically going to be expanded into Pakistan slightly, but it is unrecognizable when you really think about it. From there, India is going to take the majority of the rest of the land, with the Russians only getting a little bit. They're also technically going to push out into Xinjiang, just trying to expand their influence in the region, whilst Tibet is going to be given independence pretty much just as an Indian client state. The Indians are also going to be given multiple border client states just to provide as buffers for the Indians, which are to be annexed fairly soon. They also take some lands for themselves from these new allies that the Russians gave to them, annexing Bangladesh, setting up the Muslims as not an equal party, but a fairly equal party. They also take most of Myanmar's coastline and a slight amount of the rest of the land, leaving a good amount to Thailand, who is massively expanded into a regional power, rivaling Vietnam, which is the goal. Russia isn't prioritizing Thailand as they were a not so cooperative ally, so they want Thailand and Vietnam to just squander over the region until eventually they're both incredibly weak to backstab and kill them. Xinjiang is set up as a new state, as are multiple central Chinese client states under the Russians, until eventually the actual Russian gains are seen, which is just in central and northern China. The rest of China is going to be turned into a client state, with it all ending up under Russian control. No new China, just incredibly weak in general Chinese state under a different name, which honestly I cannot tell you. With that, Russia will claim global hegemony, although this is not the new Pax Russianana, I don't know. It was always Anna, like Britannica Americana. I don't know what they would call it, but this is not full-on Russian hegemony. The Yellow Team is still a powerful influence in the region, and the Great War has not yet happened. The world may be like this for a few more years, but at this point, so many countries have changed everything. I cannot predict. And although this video is fully unrealistic, with the Russians having way more land and being way more stable than they actually should have, I do still hope you enjoyed. As for the power rankings, I would actually put Russia in first. The US may still have an economical advantage, but with these lands out of China, along with all of their client states to help them, I think the Russian military and possibly eventually economy, economy would surpass the US. I had not zoomed out and looked at this Russian state. It is massive. The largest empire that the world has ever seen, I can say quite confidently. And probably the most important country to ever live now. Russia's gone from maybe not failing, but the right word is stagnating economy and a worsening military, losing lots of equipment and manpower in Ukraine, to a dominant force on the world stage, even making the US cower behind their friends. With that, I am going to end this video. Just going to draw in these new Thai borders, which honestly, Thailand, I wouldn't mind if you got this. Maybe not these exact borders, but something down here just looks so much better than all the random little countries. I'm now going to color all Russian allies. Well, actually, no. I'm not just going to do that. we are going to see exactly who's an ally, aka India, who is not on par, but an equal ally to Russia, at least in their eyes, in everyone's eyes, really. India is I can say that with quite some confidence, the third most powerful country in the world, still behind the United States and obviously behind Russia, but quite powerful. And Tibet and the other Indian states are of course going to go with them as allies, as are the Siamese. As for pretty much all the rest of the Chinese lands, I can't do yellow. What color can I do here? I suppose I'll just do this darker orange. This is a Russian puppet / client state. The Russians have full control over it, can tell them what to do, when to do it, and they are not equal partners, but subpar partners. Eventually, the Chinese may grapple their way out of this position, but they will never surpass them again. We also have the Middle East being completely under their control, and the DRC, who is at least to some extent under Russian control. With that, the new Cold War starts between Asia and Eastern Europe, and the Americas and Western Europe. I also do hope you enjoyed this video. Don't know if you like this kind of video where we just have one country taking over and everyone else trying to survive, with the most detailed war at the end, but I'll see you all next time, and goodbye.